In this video I want to talk about how to set the right exposure, contrast and saturation when you're starting a grade. Doing that without any reference can be pretty tough. When you're just looking at one single image, it's not always clear if it's too dark, too bright, too flat or too saturated. But the moment you compare 2 or 3 versions side by side, like in a split screen, it becomes way easier to see what's working and what's not. That is why I created this Test Strip DCTL. But one thing at a time. Here I have some footage. In the last node I set up a CST and we are converting from Verilog C3 to Rec 709. I will add 3 nodes. One for exposure, one for contrast and one for saturation. Trying to find the right exposure without a direct reference can be pretty tough. Same goes for contrast and saturation. One way to handle it is by right-clicking and selecting Grab Still. That takes a snapshot of the current grade. Then you can tweak something like exposure and compare the 2 images to see which one feels better. Another option is to make a new version. Just right-click on Create a new version to set up a second one. Make your changes and then use split screen. You can compare multiple versions side by side. All of this takes quite a bit of time. So to make things faster and more efficient, I built this DCTL called Test Strip. In the darkroom days, test strips were used to determine the ideal exposure for a photo print by exposing small sections of photo paper for different durations. I dropped this DCTL after the exposure, contrast and saturation nodes. So we can increase the number of splits up to 9. The split full frame button shows all versions full screen. You can also shift the focus left or right to better judge specific areas. Now I can bump the exposure up by 1 stop. The center always shows my original. This kind of direct comparison makes it much easier to decide what looks right. And that's how our eyes work. It's way easier to judge something when you can see it side by side. Once I'm happy with the exposure, I turn off the mode and move on to contrast. I can quickly push the exposure and adjust the contrast at the same time, more or less depending on the look. You can also flip the contrast, meaning show less contrast on the right side. For example, increasing it in 0.1 or 0.2 steps per split. Same idea with saturation, more or less saturation depending on what you're after. And of course you can combine contrast, increase contrast, and you will see it also increases saturation automatically because contrast affects also the saturation, and you can also turn the saturation checkbox on and click on flip. This whole approach is way faster than grabbing stills or creating new versions every time. It's a super efficient way to figure out the right exposure, contrast and saturation for your grade. In the transform section you can choose different log curves, like Verilog C3, DaVinci White Gamut, Intermediate or ACES. As you can see, whether I'm adjusting exposure, flipping contrast or pushing saturation, I can preview different looks really quickly, and just being able to generate that many versions with one click saves a ton of time compared to the usual workflow. There are 2 ways to use this DCTL. One way is as a kind of split screen setup. You adjust exposure, contrast and saturation in the nodes before the DCTL, and then just use the DCTL to preview how the image would look like with more or less exposure or contrast or saturation. The other option is to use the sliders inside the DCTL to tweak exposure, contrast and saturation directly. Once you've landed on a look you like, you just turn off the DCTL and manually copy over the values. So if exposure inside the DCTL was set to a certain value, I'll just dial that in outside the DCTL, because I'm not using the DCTL for final grading, just to define the hero shot. Adding saturation in the film strip DCTL uses subtractive saturation, kind of HSV style. And when you're lowering saturation, it behaves like DaVinci's default saturation control. One last thing, if you set the split screen to just 2, the left image will be the original. On the right side, you can go through all the checkboxes. Add more exposure, flip exposure, increase or reduce contrast using the flip checkbox, and adjust saturation up or down. You will find more info on my website. There's also a free demo you can download and test with your own footage. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email. That's it. Have a great day and see you next time.